so something must have come between them. So here we have the first skeleton of the catacombs. Notice it is destroyed by these exploding skulls that float nearby. But then it reassembles itself. That is because there is a necromancer somewhere abouts that is keeping the skeleton alive. Notice the skeletons also have white eyes. This is different from the other enemies we've met so far, which all have red eyes. So now, using the divine weapon that we ascended with Andre of Astora, we are able to destroy the skeleton permanently. The divine energy of this weapon is able to override the power of the necromancers. Now, just leaving that thought for a second, notice here, this pile of filth here is the same texture that we saw over in the depths, in the ruins of Astora, with a few extra added bodies. This links this area to Astora and the ruler of Astora, Velka. And also, just from a story point of view, just notice how the bodies here have just been dumped into the catacombs. This is very different from the haphazard burial that we saw up in the graveyard, and different from the graves we'll see below where everything is very ordered. This is the dead at the end of the world, just shoved into the catacombs from above before the undertakers have fled the catacombs. So jumping back to the idea about the divine energy being able to destroy the skeletons in the catacombs, this is what's being shown in the red-white shield representing the first flame. The divine power belongs to all three lords, not just Gwyn, and that is why the weapon has magical energy, not lightning energy, which is associated with Gwyn. The power of the first flame is able to overcome the magic of the necromancers, because the magic of the necromancers is blasphemous to the idea of the first flame. And so here we have the first necromancer greeting us with his flame. And this is the flame that keeps the skeletons alive when they're destroyed by non-divine means. And this goes back to an idea we haven't discussed for a very long time, which is the cycle of the bonfires. The cycle of the bonfires respawns the enemies in Lordran, just like this fire here keeps the skeletons alive, all of which is completely unnatural and against the idea of the first flame, that there is life and that there is death, that there is heat and that there is cold, there is light and that there is dark. So now let's have a chat about these scarabs, these insects that are all over this room. You may recognize these, as these were one of the first things we ever saw when we came to Lordran. In the undead asylum, in the cage that we awoke in, there is a trail of these bugs on the floor, linking something or someone associated with that room to something or somebody in the catacombs. Notice these statues here, they have a face on them. And this is the face of a bearded man. This is the face of the valiant father, and we'll be getting the items that name this face by the end of the episode. So notice that tumbling attack that the skeletons do. That's an important attack. You'll probably notice that this is a reoccurring pattern with the monster design, is that there's usually one or two attacks that really tell the story of Dark Souls. Now notice this waterfall here that falls from a gap above, and silver light streams in through that gap. Now if we think back to the discussions of the undead church, which we have talked about represents Priscilla and her city of Ulasil, recall that the statue of Priscilla appears wet. The relief that represents Ulasil looks wet, while the images of the Daughters of Chaos look dry. Notice here the floor looks all wet. Part of Priscilla's symbols are not just silver, but also a wet silver. And we're seeing that here in the catacombs, because this was once her domain. So notice that there are 3 skeletons that we've seen so far. The giant skeleton, a skeleton without a shield that wields a falchion, and a skeleton with the warrior's round shield that wields a scimitar. This represents the family that ruled the catacombs. Nito being represented by the giant skeletons, Priscilla being represented by the skeleton without the shield, and Velka being represented by the skeleton with the warrior's round shield. Now I know the shield was redesigned for the remastered edition, and I understand why that was done. The team really wanted to push the idea of Priscilla ruling the catacombs, but as you can see, it starts to mess with the lore just slightly. The skeleton without the shield was meant to, in my interpretation, was meant to represent Priscilla. So as we move through this area, let's discuss how Priscilla ended up in the catacombs and what was her relationship with Nito, the first of the dead. Well, Priscilla was born in Enolondo during the First Age of Fire, and she was the daughter of Seath the Scaleless and the Witch of Isolith. But just as we saw above, where Petrus, a symbol of Seath the Scaleless, was leading Rhea of Tharalan down into the catacombs, this is what Seath the Scaleless did to Priscilla. He took Priscilla out of Enolondo and gave her to Nito, the first of the dead, to be his wife, so that he would protect her from any advances from Gwyn. And so we start to see the idea of cycles coming through in the story of Dark Souls, and why it's a useful tool in trying to decipher the lore of this game. Just as Menace was forced to marry Velka at the demands of his master Gwyn, Priscilla was forced to marry Nito, the first of the dead, at the demands of her father Seath the Scaleless. Both Menace and Priscilla were forced into unions that they were not happy with. So just pausing with that story for the moment, here we have the first instance of this statue. Notice there are 2 faces on this statue, a face at the top and a face in the stomach. This is a mother with child, and more specifically, it is the kindly mother at the top and the naive child in the stomach. Again, we will get the item descriptions that name these faces later. Now notice that the child, when we come close to it, shoots 3 spikes out of it. 2 out of its eyes and 1 out of its mouth. Just like the slimes that we saw in the depths. And this symbolizes the fact that those slimes that we met are also symbols of children, just like those basilisks that we also found down in the depths. So that monster has become slightly more complicated than what we discussed before. And just now, notice that I just got humanity from these skeletons. Now that might seem a little bit odd, because these skeletons don't seem to be human, like the hollow soldiers that we defeated earlier to get humanity. But this is the nature of humanity. It's not that it's associated with specifically humans or humanoids. It's about one's connection to this plane of existence, to this existence of Lordran. And these skeletons still have a connection to this world. They still have a purpose. They still have a mission. So they are stuck here, just like everything else that has humanity. And as we think about that, about these skeletons being very similar to those hollow soldiers that we fought, it's also good to think about that hollow soldier that we saw in the undead parish a very long time ago, who ran for a switch to drop the gate because he feared the chosen undead, to protect the undead church and the congregation inside. These skeletons are also protecting something. And that is why they're still here, even though they just seem like wandering monsters. And over there by the other switch, we see Trusty Patches, a proud knight. And he is an NPC with a quest line, and therefore he has an equivalent lord, an equivalent god that he represents. And he represents Nito, the first of the dead. Now notice quickly that these spikes damage me as I go past, and this requires me to slow down whenever I get near one of these statues. This is just like the Basilisk Curse. It's also, now that we can add the slimes to this, the fact that the slimes are so difficult to kill. The symbols of the children are attempting to slow our progress through Lordran. Now notice that bridge just moved. We are being helped out by our friend Trusty Patches.
Good day. You look reasonably sane. What are you doing in the Catacombs? You're a cleric or something.
You should always tell Trusty Patches that you are not a cleric.
Well, that's strange. I know what it is. You've come for the trim kids, haven't you? Well, whatever it is, this place is treacherous. Do you watch your step?
And that's Trusty Patches. You're either a cleric or a grave robber in his eyes. And when it comes to the second one, you most likely are. Now notice that he wears the black leather armor set, the one that we found by the symbols of the Daughters of Chaos in the basement. But he doesn't wear the thief's mask. That is because he is not associated with a thief. Also notice that he wears a shield with the insignia of an eagle. Is the old insignia of the first army that fought the everlasting dragons. He also wields a winged spear, showing that he is one of the earliest warriors. And once he served in Gwyn's army, but now he has turned his back on all of that. Just like Nito once fought alongside Gwyn, but then turned his back on all of it. So we'll return to Trusty Patches later. Right now, I'd like to return to the idea of Priscilla and what Priscilla was doing down here in the Catacombs. What was her role while she was married to Nito? And we can see that here in this room behind the statue of mother and child, and also behind the waterfall that we saw as we entered the Catacombs. And it is linked to Rhea of Tharalin's mission that we got from Petrus by bribing him. The quest for kindling. Notice these vases that are throughout the Catacombs. These vases contain human remains. Here in this room, we will now kindle the flame. So what is kindling? What does it mean to kindle? We have had the ability to kindle since the beginning of the game, just as we were able to reverse hollowing ever since the beginning of the game. The reverse hollowing was an art developed by Velka and has been given to us by her. The art of kindling is the same. It is a sacred, ancient ritual that Velka rediscovered, that Velka either rediscovered or developed. And now that we are human, we can perform this sacred ritual. We can take one of these sprites of humanity that we hold within our bosom and sacrifice it to the flame, making the flame stronger. And now this flame acts just like the bonfires we find with the firekeepers. We can now get 10 Estus flasks from this flame. So what does this have to do with Nito, Velka, Priscilla, and everybody else in Lordran? And why does the Way of White concern itself with kindling? It's because the Way of White would have been concerned about the kindling at one point. It's just not now with Petrus that it means anything. The first flame didn't just burn. It needed to be fed, and it needed to be fed humanity. It needed to be fed dark. It needed to be fed fuel to keep it alight. And in the early age of fire, that is what Nito did down in the Catacombs. He harvested humanity from the dead, and when he was joined by Priscilla and by Velka, they joined him in that sacred duty of harvesting the dark and feeding it back into the first flame, so that the cycle of life and death can continue. Now this may seem odd because it's not explicitly mentioned in the game, but that's because Dark Souls overtly concerns itself with the extremes, the light and the dark. But the first flame is a representation of the middle ground of those two forces, and that is why the Witch of Izalith and her statue sits in Firelink Shrine between Enolondo and the Catacombs. She was responsible for tending to the flame with the dark that was provided by Nito. And this is the reason why the flames fade. It is because its balance has been upset. If you allow a flame to get too bright, it will burn its fuel faster than you can restock the fuel, and it will go out. And on the other side of that, if you put too much fuel onto a flame, it will suffocate the flame and put it out. And that's the difference between those that covet the light and those that covet the dark. Gwyn covets the light. He wants the light without the dark, and therefore he will burn out any flame. Those that covet the dark will suffocate that flame with their humanity. And always remember that the people who covet the dark still need the flame. Without the flame, there is no time, and so there is no ability to revel in your darkness. So that was a little bit closer than I'd hoped. But returning to Gwyn, this was why the first flame faded. It was because Gwyn took more than he should have. And this introduces another important theme of Dark Souls, which is the sin of avarice, the consequences of greed. And we have now the three important themes of Dark Souls: cycles, family, and greed. And these are all interrelated themes with each other that we will discuss as we go. So we're going to shift gears now. So we've talked about kindling and the first flame, and we'll return to that as we move along in the Catacombs. But the Catacombs isn't just the story of Nito and Priscilla and Velka. It is also a set of symbols, a shared grave, if you will, where the different tombs of the different characters have been laid out. And we're coming up to one of those right now.